Welcome to the Hunting Beast Podcast, your source for hunting tactics, news, and stories. And now your host, Mario Traficante.
Hello, and welcome to Episode 2 of the Hunting Beast Podcast. Today we'll be discussing deer sign with the big buck serial killer himself, Dan Infalt.
Alright, welcome to this week's podcast discussion. We're here with Dan Infalt, the big buck serial killer. My name is Mario Traficante, I'll be your host. Today we're going to discuss sign, different types of sign that you can encounter while in the woods, and how it may impact your hunt. So with that, why don't we start out talking about scrapes a little, and how you used them, Dan, to impact your hunts and adjust your hunt.
I think we're going to talk about scrapes. I think the first thing we got to get across with scrapes and rubs, or any deer sign for that matter, is that you got to look at the big picture here. We all know deer are nocturnal, right?
Yep.
So big bucks, for whatever reason, are extremely nocturnal. You know, whether it's from, some phase in their life, or if it's because of pressure has put them that way. But it seems like when you run into mature bucks, you've only got about, half an hour of daylight movement. You get up just before, or just at, sunset. And a lot of times they're bedded before it's even daylight.
Right.
So when you think about that, think about all the scrapes and stuff they lay down. When do they do it? They don't do it when they're sleeping. So if they're up all night and they're only up for that little fraction of time during the day, that little, 1/20th of their time frame, when are they laying those scrapes and rubs? They're doing it at night. And most guys are going out and they're setting up on that kind of sign. They're setting up on rubs, they're setting up on scrapes. They wander through the woods aimlessly and they find a big rub or a big scrape, and the bigger the better. You hear the guys all the time, well, this scrape was as big as a car hood, so that's why they sit there. But really, you gotta ask yourself, what's the possibility that this was made at night or daytime?
Right.
So I've had a lot of action on scrapes. I've seen deer work rubs, and I've hunted rub lines, and I've hunted scrapes, and killed a lot of deer. As a matter of fact, arguably my best deer with bow have been killed with over scrapes. And the reason being is I relate that sign back to bedding again. So everything I'm doing is relating to bedding. If you don't know where they're bedding, you're not in the game, because of, that little bit of window of daylight movement, how far they get from that bedding.
And arguably, a lot of guys, including myself, if you walk into an area and I see a significant rub or a scrape, you get excited. And you want to position yourself close to that scrape or rub, because without knowing where the bed is, you're anticipating that I'm going to see a mature buck, or I'm going to at least get action because I'm in close proximity to this aggressive sign. And the reality of it is that sign probably was done at night most of the time, like you just said. So what I've seen you do, and some of the times that we've gone out scouting, is you'll actually look at that scrape or rub, but then you'll continue to look beyond it. You'll continue to follow the deer path back to where you think the potential bedding is. And I guess describe that a little. Describe your thought pattern when you're doing that.
Well, the first thing I'm doing when I find a scrape or a rub or something that I'm interested in, if it looks like a mature deer did it, it's going to catch your interest. It's going to catch anybody's interest. But if I'm nowhere near bedding, I totally disregard it. It doesn't matter to me. All it means to me is that there's a big buck in that woods or on that property, at least some of the time. And it might be just at night. What I want to do is find that sign near bedding, or I want to find that sign in relation to bedding, or be able to give you a reason to why that sign there. And by that I mean, let's go back to last week. We were talking about that island that me and you both
right.
had our our encounters with that buck on, right?
Right.
Okay, when I walked in there and I saw that sign, I said, a buck laid the sign in daylight. Remember me saying that?
Yep.
And why is that? It wasn't because there's buck bedding right there. It was because there's doe bedding right there. They're laying that sign while they're checking to see if those does are bedded. So I have a reason on why those bucks were there. And then when you sat there that day, you had 2 bucks go by.
Right. And the other unique thing about that spot is that we had actually walked through that area on previous hunts in the previous year, and we noticed that there was old rubs and there was old sign. But again, I looked through it and I was a little bit excited, like, hey, here's this down tree, there's some significant old rubs on it, and you kind of looked at it and said, well, yeah, but there's nothing that looks like it's came here in the last year. And so, and didn't think twice about it and kept on moving forward looking for something else. So I think that's another point with an area like that is make sure the sign is fresh. I mean, typically you can go out and pick up on rubs that happened within, the 2 previous seasons, but how fresh is it? Was it laid down by a mature buck that's in the area this year when you're hunting? Or is it something from last year's rut?
Yeah. You gotta hunt hot sign when hot sign is hot.
Right. Right. And in that case, it was exactly it, because going back and hunting that spot within a week of when you saw that sign open up afforded me that encounter with that mature buck.
Let's talk about what's been successful for me with rubs and scrapes. And what's been successful for me has been finding those rubs or scrapes right adjacent to bedding. And most of the time when I find an active scrape next to bedding, it's usually where 2 mature buck bedding areas are close by and they both stage in the same spot. They come out and they stage there before they move on to whatever it is, what food source or whatever. And it's like I don't want to call it a meeting place. They don't come out at the same time or whatever, but they both go there, lay down their scent, and the other one will come out and check it out.
And then they disperse.
Yeah, they're somehow communicating with each other there.
The other thing that you mentioned before, too, about these buck beds being in proximity to the scrapes is that those beds might not be used all year round. I mean, again, it depends on the bed, but you mentioned before that certain beds might just be rut beds, and a scrape or a rub might be an indicator of a doe bedding adjacent to an area where a buck might have a satellite bed where he only hangs out just to monitor the doe bedding area.
That's true. And in the case of that island where you had those encounters, that was the case. That bed was a rut bed set up specifically to monitor those does. I mean, we went and looked at that bed as soon as we were done, with hunting season.
Right.
I always do that. When I have a big buck encounter, I backtrack them things after the season and see exactly what happened. And when we did that, we found that bed, and it was set up in a way to monitor those does coming out of that bedding area. And that's why when that doe came through, he popped out right behind her.
Right. Right.
But that said, I can think of 2 very large bucks that I shot on scrapes that were being made in one was in September and one was in early October. And those scrapes were used year-round as a community, spot to communicate for the deer. And one of them was that 400-pound slob buck.
Right.
That buck, I seen him right next to a public land parking lot. Mm-hmm. He was crossing this little creek and staging right there. And there was a spot on the road where if I parked right next to the parking lot and got my car in the right spot, I could watch him come out at night, 100 yards from his parking lot behind it, and glass him. And he would go and work this scrape all the time. But the predominant wind just blew right in there,
okay,
right into his bedding area. So I was waiting for the right wind. And there was him and another large 10-point that came out too. And they both worked that scrape. They both came out of bedding areas next to each other, worked that scrape, and would move on. And the day I shot that buck, I finally got the right wind. I went in there. I didn't even use a tree stand. I just got up in this big willow crotch. I sat there, and the first buck in was that 140 class 10-pointer. Now this is public access land too.
Right.
140, 100 yards from the parking lot.
Right.
This 140-inch buck comes through the river, walks up, works the scrape, and I'm contemplating, should I shoot him? And I'm thinking, no, I got to hold out for that big buck. I got to give that a chance. I let that guy leave, and I'm watching him, and I'm kind of kicking myself because not every day you see him there.
Right.
I've seen him regular though. And then out of the corner of my eye, I see a little ripple in the river, and here comes that big boy. And I had to lay there in that willow tree in that crotch, 6 feet off the ground, looking at that thing in the eyes as it walked straight at me up this trail.
Right.
Straight at me. And I shot him as he worked that scrape right after the 10-pointer worked it. And now, another buck that I got that was probably scored bigger than the 400-pound slob was a giant 11-pointer. It was really wide. It's like 25 inside. And that one, was almost Boone and Crockett. If it had that 12th point, it would be easy.
Right.
But that buck, I shot opening weekend on one of those scrapes. So that one too, I went out there during the summer and watched this thing blast him from a hilltop. He was bedding in a swamp, and he was bedding in one of those little bowls in a river.
Right.
And he'd come out of that bowl and work this scrape, even in the summer. He didn't always paw it, but he worked the branch. And I went up bear hunting that year. And I shot my bear on opening day and came running back. And as soon as I got back, it was like on and off raining. And I knew when it stopped raining, that buck was going to work that scrape. So I ran out there, middle of the day at noon. It stops raining. At 1 o'clock, here comes that buck. Comes walking right in, shot him point blank. And those are two of the biggest bucks I've ever shot with a bow, both over scrapes.
Early in the season, too.
Right. And both of them within 100 yards of their bed. You find a scrape next to a bedding area, that's golden.
So that's kind of what I identified from the story that you're talking about, is that, one, you identified a scrape that's being used earlier in the season or even in the off season in the summer, and then you set up observation on this area to actually see what was coming in and use it, which I think is a pretty important part in both of those stories you talked about, and then to actually locate the bedding in proximity to that scrape, instead of just setting up kind of willy-nilly on the area without knowing exactly how long a deer might have until it can get to there if it's coming out of its bed. So yeah, definitely important points about setting up or hunting a scrape and using it as a pattern in the early season.
Here's another story for you. A guy I used to work with, Mark Taddy. I haven't seen him in years. Back in the 80s, he was hunting with me on a farm that I had permission on. I took him along, and we had a little friendly bet on who could get the biggest buck. And he hunted over one of those scrapes that split two beds.
Okay.
And real early in the day, and this is in, probably the end of September. In comes a nice 9-pointer. He shoots it, and he's, all happy, proud, and whatever. And I got you beat. Well, 2 days later, I go through there, and there's new rubs opened up going towards that scrape.
Right.
So I go sit on that scrape, and out of the other bedding area comes the other 9-pointer. It's almost identical to his, and we had to call it a tie when I shot that thing because they're both the same size on the same scrape a couple days later.
Right. So one of the dominant bucks gets eliminated, and the next one comes in.
Well, no, you're reading that wrong. I had two bedding areas, two different bucks are using.
Sure.
They're both using that scrape. It had nothing to do with another one taking that over.
Right.
He shot the one from the one bedding area. I shot the one from the other.
Right, I get it. So it's similar to the first story that you talked about, where you have two bucks that are communicating with each other or trying to put their scent down to become the dominant buck in that area. So it's a communication tool.
Yeah, there's something else I should probably point out there, or I'll get a bunch of emails because I always do. That I don't normally hunt a spot right after it's been hunting or right after somebody kills a deer there.
Right.
But sign don't lie. The rubs are still coming out of that bedding area, still going to that scrape, and they're fresh, hey, I'm going in there giving it a shot.
So, I guess, what are some other tips you can give? I mean, for example, we had an area that we walked past on a fairly regular basis going to one of our hunting spots that had a significant amount of rubs that were opened up. And we could see it, we'd observe it. We even kicked a buck out after dark every once in a while coming back out passing that area. It wasn't until after the season when we actually went back and scouted that we determined kind of what the setup was and what was happening, and that was the area by that pond that we walked past, where we found the bed, and it was in proximity to a little kind of micro island next to the pond. And what did we find on that little micro island, just adjacent to all those rubs?
A ton of doe bedding. Yeah.
Right.
Now, the doe bedding I didn't expect, but if you remember, us walking back there to go hunting, me pointing out that tree out in the cattails that was on that little point leading to those trees, and I said, the buck that's making these rubs is bedded right there.
Right.
Where did we find his bed?
Right there at the base of that.
Exactly.
It was in the cattails, is one of the only mature trees that was off an outcropping.
And how far was that bed from those rubs?
In total, the farthest one, probably 50 yards, 50, 60 yards.
Yeah. And all the times we jumped that buck coming out of there, did we ever see him there in daylight?
No.
You got to push that envelope.
No. Because in fact, I bumped him when I was already in my truck once driving out, and he was further back in the field, but yeah, it was dark.
Yeah, I seen him 3 or 4 times there coming out, but we were walking 2 miles out of that swamp.
Right.
By the time we were getting out there, it was an hour after dark before he was rubbing those trees. And he's only going 50, 75 yards.
Right.
So what chance does a guy hunting 200 yards away from him have?
Right.
He's got to get lucky or catch that buck on a day when he's just overly aggressive and horned up or something. And we determine now, if we draw that area, where to move to.
Right.
And we can go in there and we can kill that buck now, because after the season, we went back and tracked that back and really just confirmed what I already knew. It was right where I thought he was. The only thing that we would have did wrong is if we just bumbled in there, I wouldn't have expected all those does there, and that would have probably blown it for us.
Right.
If we went in there blind.
Right. Because we would have kicked a lot of deer going in. I know another spot, guys, getting back to talking about when you see a convergence of sign, scrapes, trails running in together, talking about that staging area again. We had another hunt that, again, was back in a swamp, but we had kicked a couple bucks on our way in, and then you described, as you started walking the transition edge of the island, that you came into an area that had a couple components that made you want to get up a tree right away and sit there. And you actually ended up shooting a buck that day out of that tree on the first sit. But those components, there was a scrape there was a rub there, and then talk about what you saw as far as a convergence of all these trails.
Okay, with that hunt, if we're talking about the same one, that was 2 miles back in a swamp. And we hadn't ever been back there before,
right.
to that far.
Right.
That was about as far back as we could get. And we first went over that on the computer, and I studied that. And I said, okay, I know this area is remote. If something big's in there, this is where he's going to be holing up. Now where's the bedding? And I looked, and there's a big island back there. There's a point of an island that went into that swamp. And you look around, and it's kind of open cattails, red brush, and then on the one side, the west side, I believe.
Yep.
It was there was a tamarack swamp.
Right.
That went in there, and it had some good edge, some good piles of dogwood along the edge of it and stuff. And I thought, man, if there's a buck in there, that's where he's going to bed. So I knew I wanted to look that edge of the island. I wanted to walk up and down that edge and look for bucks coming out of that swamp to that hardwood island. And when I looked at the map, I could see the deer trails coming out of certain little patches of dogwood and at certain tree bases. and I could see them go to one point all meeting. And I determined that that's probably where I want to be, but I didn't want to go in there, and not give everything a chance, sit in the wrong spot and have the deer come out 100 yards down.
Right.
So I walked that whole edge, walked back, and determined that, yep, exactly where I picked on the map is where I need to be. Walked in there. You can see the staging area. All the trails that I could see on the map were still there. They came out and they met in one spot, and there's a scrape under that. And I thought, all right. There's a scrape where a whole bunch of bedding areas, the trails meet.
Right.
So I climbed that tree, and I don't think I was there very long, was I?
No, because I wasn't even set up in my stand yet.
Yeah. He didn't come straight in, though, arguably. He got up, and he was with another buck, and he was sparring, and he started moving off, and he wasn't coming directly to me.
Right.
But I heard him get out of his bed because it was all water. I could hear him sloshing.
Right.
And then you could hear him sparring. And then the sparring got a little further away. And I did something I don't do a lot. I got out the old desperation call. I gave him a couple grunts. He turned around, and he came right in. And probably because that's the spot where all them bucks meet.
Right.
So he's expecting a buck to be there.
Yeah, he heard that noise, and he's expecting another buck to be there in the staging
That's where the community
area.
scrape is for all the beds around there. He came in, he actually worked a tree really hard right next to me. And as soon as he stepped out of the way from that tree, from the clearing, I shot him. And there was another scrape buck.
Right. Well, and I guess talking about fresh sign and hunting, fresh sign in the similar area, but further, south on another island, we had identified that there was more rubs traveling north and south on one of the main trails that goes across those islands. And actually the buck that I shot last year was on a doe on one of those main trails, traveling north, potentially back to that bedding area when I got him. But, one of the key things, I guess, that rings in my mind about the sign in that particular set is that, the first year we had hunted that spot when we didn't quite have as much as a handle on the topography of the area, you had picked out that point off that island as kind of a community point where all the trails converged as it transitioned onto the next northern island. And actually right at that point, as close to where I sat, and there was another scrape, a large scrape right on the transition line to go from the southern island to the northern island, that were both higher islands full of timber with, red brush and cattail transition in between. With my buck, that doe came out. She went right to that scrape, put her nose down, she scented it, and not 2 minutes later, the buck I took came walking directly on her path.
Another buck over a scrape, and that's probably your biggest buck.
Right. Now, arguably that was, closer to rut, not an early season type scenario, but it was a scenario where we had been monitoring that sign in that area and it wasn't fresh. But once it became fresh, where we saw rubs open up, fresh rubs open up, a fresh scrape open up, then we knew there was probably a mature buck in the area that was active on it.
See, most people are hunting over sign. I'm hunting a land feature adjacent to bedding, and if there's sign there, great. If not, that's where I'm hunting. And I'm letting the sign tell me exactly where to put the tree stand, but I'm not hunting over sign. If I went around and hunted over rubs or scrapes, think about how many people in this world are doing that. You want to have the same success as everybody else?
Well,
that's what everybody's doing.
Yeah. The other thing I noticed, and maybe you can speak to this a little when we've gone and hunted some of these public areas, is that there can be sign a significant distance from the bedding. And some of these spots, the bedding, you're pretty familiar with the bedding. And in particular, there's been times when there's a mature buck in the area and there's a lot of pressure from other people hunting this mature buck. But you've told me how you've used sign, rub lines to actually traverse what this buck is doing and find where where they're potentially bedding. And there was kind of a buck last year on some public that you had that play out.
Yeah, in that particular spot, you have to know it though. I mean, some regular Joe ain't going to go back there, find this rub line and say, okay, they're bedding 100 yards over there. I had to find that bedding, hunt it a year or two, and start to relate things. But there's a rub line that's probably, I don't know, what do you think, 200 yards from the beds.
Right.
And I know you went out there with me to get that last buck, so you've seen all that. But
right.
That rub line's probably 200 yards from that buck, and then there's another one that's probably 400 or 500 yards from where that buck beds. Or I shouldn't say that buck bedding area.
Right.
But when those rub lines open up, I can go sit there. I know a buck's coming out. I mean, it's that easy. And I've probably killed, a dozen bucks out of that bed. If you include the ones I put friends on and stuff. I mean, every year there's a good buck beds in there. If somebody else stumbles in there, then it goes south. But it's just a great bedding spot. But instead of bumbling in there and hunting it at the wrong time, I can monitor that rub line now that I know where it's at. And when that opens up, even though it's nowhere near the bedding, there's a buck there.
Yeah.
And that's how I got that really big 10-footer. That's the Rome Legend one.
Right.
That buck was living on private land, and he would only come across the street like pre-rut. And then he would chase the does, on my side of the street.
Right.
And everybody in town was after that buck. And I just sat back, let them all chase him around and hunt him until I started hearing rumors people were shining him on the public land. I went over and checked that rub line. It was opened up. First day I hunted him. That was Halloween night.
Sure.
First night I hunted him. Shot him.
And I think was that was one of the bucks where you actually had to walk past some people that were sitting further up.
Yep.
Sitting further up on the rub line.
Yeah, I walked under people's stands. They were like, not liking me walking past them, but there's only one way to get back there. But I know damn well they're not going to shoot something sitting out of a tree in the middle of a field.
Right.
But they're sitting there because there's a rub there, or there's a scrape there, or, on a big track, and,
What's your feeling about, and I know some guys use this from time to time, is setting up a mock scrape, or going in and breaking a branch and setting up a mock licking branch, or maybe even scarring up a tree. In general, just setting up artificial sign in an area.
I think some guys are really bored and they want to do things. But honestly, though, that stuff works, but I think it works limited. I mean, it's great for guys that like trail camera pictures and stuff. But if you really want to get the real big, mature, smart deer, you got to catch them by utter surprise. Not set up in some spot where you're leaving your scent and you're putting your urine there that ain't quite what he's used to, and there's foreign odors there and stuff. You're not a deer. So I mean, it works. I've seen it work. So I'm not knocking it. I mean, if that's your thing, great. But to me, it's about catching them by utter surprise. I think those mature bucks, they get to be 5 years old or older. They're on the top of their game. One little mistake, and you're done. So I don't leave no room for error. I don't mess around with that stuff. And another thing about it is, it's like a hunter trap. You get a little action with it, you get some pictures with it and stuff, and you're playing around with this thing, and all of a sudden your season's over and you ain't got no buck.
Right.
It's like the guys that bait. I mean, they get deer coming in, and they keep hunting around it, and I seen one, or there's a big rub there, and they keep hunting it. All of a sudden their season's over.
Right. So again, a lot of it revolves back to finding out where the primary bedding is. And if you do, what I'm hearing more of is that if you do identify this sign, you're really going to set up observation on that area. You've picked out an area specifically because of its topography or how it's adjacent to bedding. And then if fresh sign starts to open up in that area, then that's one piece of the puzzle of the confirmation that there's actually a mature buck in that bed. For the most part.
Right.
And
Yep.
and then if you're able to sit back in a couple of cases you described and actually observe a mature animal coming out of there or observe a animal coming out of there, then you know that this is what's living in the area. So again, probably, less about the gimmicks and more about putting in the time and the work of actually knowing the area you're going into and putting in the time to observe that area after you've identified a spot that you want to hunt.
When you're looking at this sign a lot around these bedding areas and you get to know certain bucks, there's certain things you start coming onto. And one big thing for me has been observing these bucks coming out of these bedding areas where I know that buck. I know his rub line. I know who's in there. And there's a correlation with the height of the rub and the age of the buck. And to say I'm convinced of that is a downplay, because I'm positive of it.
Yeah.
I know it. I mean, these mature bucks, when they get to be over 5 years old, are all rubbing as high as my chest. With the center of the rub surface.
Right.
And you watch 1.5-year-old bucks rub, and they're rubbing down by my knees, below my knees. The 2.5s are at my thighs, and the 3.5s are at my waist. And if there's any room for error, it's with mature bucks. I mean, because they might be a little different. And I'm sure there's short bucks and tall bucks and crap, but for the most part, rub height means more to me than diameter. I've seen, 1.5-year-old 8-pointers with a 12-inch rack.
Right.
Rub the hell out of a 9-inch pine tree. I seen a spike scar up a pine tree one time that anybody would have thought was a great big buck. But in both those cases, he was down by the ground. It was below my knees.
Sure.
And those big bucks are rubbing up higher. And, if you call me fruity, fine. But I can guarantee you ain't no spike rubbing a tree up high.
Right.
So if you find a rub that's chest high, I guarantee you, even if it's a 4-inch tree, it's a mature buck.
Right. And that makes sense. And again, it's one of those things that you've observed through experience too, by observing a rub that's high and then actually observing the animal come out of that area.
I tell you, I even went beyond that and I did a little study on my own, and I measured rub height. I cut the study off a little bit short. I never got it finished, but I checked enough rubs to know that there's a consistency here. And there was, when I graphed the rub heights, there was like 4 peaks for the different ages. There's like certain areas or heights where not getting rubbed near as much as certain other areas. Like there's peaks, like a 1-year-old's rubbing here, a 2-year-old's rubbing here. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Yeah. So, how else do you use sign to identify potentially primary bedding versus auxiliary bedding, or doe beds versus buck beds? Does sign play into that?
A little.
Yeah.
I think it's more about finding the bedding area. And then, if you're sign, not sign, or whatever, whatever it be, you still gotta hunt it, because a lot of these mature bucks aren't laying sign by their bedding area. I mean, we just talked about a spot that I said we killed 12 bucks out of. Right? I mean, there's not very many rubs in there. There's a few, but most of the rubs are 200 yards from there.
Well, and that's another good point, because I've heard you mention this before, is that you have had times where there's been mature bucks that you've been hunting that haven't really created a whole lot of havoc close to their bedding area. I mean, they haven't rubbed up a lot of the trees, but you've seen where there has been maybe less dominant bucks in areas that you've observed be much more aggressive and rub everything up.
And I think that's, security. A big buck lives there. He ain't afraid of nobody. Nothing. He's got nothing to prove. When he's going to go lay sign down, it's going to be for a reason. He's going to be marking a doe bedding area. He's going to be, marking this, marking that. You know, other bucks respect them. They leave him alone.
Right.
You know, so he doesn't need to mark up the area. They smell he's in there, they leave him alone. You know, does that make sense?
Yeah.
Think about that.
Well, another thing that might factor into that too is actually your population density, right?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You know, and you hit a key point there, because in this area, per se, we had a really high population if you go back about 15 years ago.
Right.
And all the buck bedding areas out here were real easy to find because they're just loaded with rubs. The population plummeted because the DNR started killing all these deer in the name of CWD.
Right.
And now with the lower population, those bedding areas still got good bucks in them, but less of them, and there's no rubs.
Right.
You know,
Well,
think about that bedding area by Dave's farm. I mean, that was tore up with rubs years ago. It's still the primary bedding. It's still where we kill the big bucks. Kill less of them because there's less deer, but there's no rubs there.
Right. So some of that is population density spawns competition, whether it's several immature bucks or one or two mature bucks and more immature bucks, but they're going to compete with each other, and that competition is going to cause them to go out and put down more sign.
Well, if you think about it now, you know, I know a lot of people think bucks randomly bed all over the woods, but they don't. There's key spots they bed in.
Right.
And there's only so many of those. So when you only got so many of those spots, every buck wants to bed in those spots. And if you got a high population, every buck in the woods wants to bed in one of those spots. You know, in the lesser deer, they get spit out all over the place in the random spots.
Right.
And you know, a buck is going to mark that as his area if he's got a lot of other bucks trying to go in there. And in high populations, I'll watch a buck go into a bedding area, bed down, and another buck go in there and him get up and leave, and the next buck go in there and smell the second buck and leave. You know, the third buck might be even bigger, go in there, and then that buck gets up and leaves. There's a dominance thing that plays into it.
Right. Right.
So whenever there's dominance playing into it, there's a show of hands. And how do bucks do that? They put a big old rub there with their scent on it.
Just to mention briefly, because it's got to be brought up with sign, obviously, is just a little bit on track size, and track size leading into a bedding area, leading out of a bedding area. How have you used track size, or what's a good rule of thumb for you for that when determining a mature animal?
You drop 4 fingers in it, it's a mature animal. 4 fingers put together in your hand. You drop that in the track, it's a mature animal. And,
you know, not to dive down too far down the rabbit hole of tracking, but, you know, from a sign perspective, what features do you look for in the track per se? Well, that lets you know that's an animal that's.
I got to take that back for a second here.
You know, been there or.
Yeah, the reason I'm taking that back is because people are going to go around dropping their hands in tracks all the time, saying.
Well, the soil factors into it, and.
Right.
Yeah.
Running tracks will spread out more than four fingers. It's got to be a walking track.
Right.
And you can tell a walking track because you get a good image of the track into the ground. It's not blown out. It doesn't look like it's skidded. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And like you said, soft soil can make them spread a little further too. What was your other question?
Well, just how do you age the track? I know you've told me before, and that you have.
Well, you look at the moisture in the dust and the dirt. Is the inside of the track, you know, the ground dry? Did it break the dirt and the dirt's still wet?
Right.
Look at the pieces that are blown up onto the, you know, when that, you know, a 200-pound animal puts his hoof down, crumbs come up, right?
Right.
You look at those pieces, if you take a little twig and you flick at them, are they stuck to the ground or are they still loose?
Right.
How much detail can you see in that track? And I can say that till I'm blue in the face. You ain't going to pick that up. The only way you're going to pick that up is you go out there and you look at those tracks. And even that might not help you. But one thing that will help you is if you go out in your backyard and lay down a footprint of your own. Take a track of it every day, a picture of it every day. See how it deteriorates.
Right.
You'll start to see what I mean. And you can do that with a deer track too if you know it's fresh. Go out there and take a picture of it. Go there the next day and take a digital picture of it. And then start looking at those pictures really close. If you really want to know, that's what's going to teach you.
You got to get out there and observe it.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, when you were talking about sign before, I want to tell you, you kept wanting to ask me something, and I wanted to say this so bad. But the biggest buck I ever shot was in the 180s. That's that one I crawled up on.
Right.
That buck, I watched him bed in the same spot for 2 years. I picked up a shed antler right out of that bed of his the year before I shot him. He was there every time there was a west wind. It was a bulletproof setup. I couldn't get near him. And I let him have it. I just kept moving around, waiting for him to make a mistake, observing him, playing cat and mouse, watching for him to get far enough. And it just wasn't happening. That buck would get up and he'd move 50 yards in daylight. And there wasn't no trees around. He was under the one big tree. He bedded right underneath it, a big willow. And the important thing here is that when I went down and looked at that bed, I picked up that shed, I went down there and I eventually killed that buck there. I really looked at that bed close. I actually seen another buck, 160s, come out of there once. And I seen the smaller buck come out of there once. And I never saw a rub within 200 yards of that bed. Not a rub, not a scrape, anywhere. Most people look at that, bare spot of dirt.
Right.
And say, nah.
Well, and to be quite honest, a lot of what pictures we see on the forum, on the site, on the Beast, and other things, guys asking and identifying beds, is this a good buck bed? And here's a rub that's in the bed. And we use those things ourselves to identify that there's a mature animal in there. But that brings back another point that maybe you don't have that go-to sign that's there, but you have to use other means to identify if there's a mature animal in there. In your case, you identified it by picking up one of his sheds, but also observation of that area, from a distance. So.
Right, you're not always going to have that sign. You're not always going to have tracks. As a matter of fact, most of the time you probably don't. The ground's too hard to maintain them. You have to find a creek crossing, a low spot, a muddy field to find a track.
Right.
So a lot of it is knowing how big bucks bed. Being able to look at something and say that's where he should be. Figuring out where they're bedding and setting up on it and killing them.
Here's another thing about sign I just thought of, because I picked this up in a couple times that we were actually hunting islands in the swamp, is that as we were walking that transition, you picked out a couple areas where the foliage was actually eaten down significantly in that transition versus another area that we had walked past not 5 minutes before. So maybe talk about that a little bit, because I think that's something that maybe gets overlooked by guys.
Sure, and that's another piece of the puzzle. That's sign. When you look out there and you're walking along and it's all dogwood, and then a little while later it's still all dogwood, all of a sudden it's all chewed up.
Right.
There's more deer activity right there. Now that could be in the middle of the night, especially if it's the only patch of dogwood that's all chewed up.
Right.
But when everywhere around there's got dogwood, not chewed up, and this is, there's probably something to that. So then you can relate it back to, is there bedding around it? Mm-hmm. Which is going to be my answer to everything you ask.
Yep.
Because I think I found this sign. Well, is there bedding around it?
Right. Because I think this particular spot, there was some dogwood mixed in there, and then it transitioned onto the island, and there was a high spot with some green, and that green, I don't know if it was in a 15 or 20 yard area, was definitely eaten down comparatively to the rest of the stuff around it. I think both you and I on different occasions set up on that spot. We never saw a buck. We did have doe come out of a doe bedding area in that spot. But it definitely was an indicator that there was deer coming there on a regular basis. I guess some other sign that you've pointed out is often on these islands you look for whether or not acorns are dropping, but not only whether or not acorns are dropping, but how they look when they're on the ground. What do you look for?
Acorns, it's like this. There's acorns everywhere. Everywhere there's high ground, there's acorns, right?
Yeah.
But in a swamp, deer live in the watery areas, the wet areas, right?
Right.
Off of the tips of points and stuff, right? There ain't oak trees out there. They got to travel to oak trees. Now, they don't have to travel far. They come up off of a point. Maybe they got to go 50, 75 yards.
Right.
But the oak trees that are getting hit off of those points, that's where you're going to kill those bucks. So I'm setting up on points that are timbered with oak trees and stuff, and using oak trees, but there's oak trees everywhere.
Yeah.
But I'm still killing deer on those oaks because I'm hunting the ones that are closest to the bed, where he's coming up on his point, feeding his way back while he's staging, waiting for dark.
And we've actually checked for fresh dropping acorns in those areas. And actually, I mean, again, a variety of animals can create this sign, but it's still one indicator. Are the acorns that are on the ground, do you see acorn shells? Do you see acorn shucks? Do you see activity that there's been deer or animals in there on those acorns? That can be another indication. And does it tie into a predominant trail that comes into the area, or a predominant trail that leads you to bedding?
First I got out the acorn cruncher. No, I'm not going there. A lot of deer have died from walking a transition line where the swamp meets the woods,
right,
and finding that sign you're talking about on an oak tree on the edge of that swamp. When those acorns are dropping, if you don't know anything about the area, put that tree stand on your back, get the wind in your face out of the swamp, and just walk that transition line until you find sign under one of those oak trees. Set up.
Yeah, I mean,
the one big one on that, though, is don't walk so close to that transition line that you stumble onto the trail and go, oh, this is good, and then back up. Because that swamp's going to be thick, right? So you got to be able to stay 50 yards off that swamp edge.
Right.
Because you got to have a buffer to shoot. You got to have an area that you can kill this thing with. So you stay back a little bit. Don't walk that trail right to where it comes out of the swamp. Because when that deer comes out and smells that you've walked there, he's turning around going back in and you got no shot.
Right.
You got to let him get out into the open a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, and really what you're saying, you keep reiterating the same points. Rubs and scrapes are the two primary signs that you look for and key in on, but they got to be fresh, and they got to be in proximity to an area that
I wouldn't say I look at and key in on them. I wouldn't go that far. I'd say that I notice them.
Right.
And I would say that, a big rub that's fresh on a trail coming out of a bedding area is probably going to make me smile, but I'm probably there to hunt that buck anyway.
Right. Well, that's my point. You're there to hunt the bedding area, and the rub and the scrape are kind of like icing on the cake as affirmation.
The biggest thing about that is it's a confidence builder.
Right. Right. And so, with a lot of these things, finding this sign is all about finding it in proximity to where you believe that the bedding is going to exist. I mean, if I think about the buck I shot, a couple seasons ago, we believe that the bedding was north of where I shot him. Now, when we think back, the southern island that he ended up dying on, which he ran to, was the island that had the oaks on it and was full of dropping acorns, and his belly was full.
And if you remember, we kind of knew where that buck was bedding.
Right.
I tried first, getting him to come all the way to those acorns, which wasn't that far. What was that, 150 yards from his bed?
Yeah.
And he didn't make it
right.
in daylight. And you pushed the envelope. It was your turn. You pushed it further. And you probably, when we went back there, I don't think you were 40 or 50 yards from that bed.
No.
But it was so thick
right.
that you're able to get up that tree quietly and set up on him.
Right. And really, he ran... after I shot him, he ran maybe another 60, 70 yards to get to that other island where the oak was and died almost.
And he died right where I was hunting him.
Right, exactly. He died right where you were hunting him. But that's a case there where, people talk about signs. So, when we cyber scouted that spot, but you walked into that area, you identified that there was dropping acorns, you identified that there was kind of a convergence of trails in that area, and you got up in a tree and you hunted it first, and sort of the point I wanted to make is that you seldom backtrack on the same day that you see sign and backtrack and hunt a spot that you passed earlier.
I either set up or move forward.
Right.
There's no going back. You don't go past sign and go back.
And explain to someone why, it's not a good idea to. And even if you think it was the wrong decision that you passed at that sign, and that was the hot sign. If you walked past it or walked through it, and you go beyond it, what are you doing when you backtrack and you walk back to that sign and set up?
You hunting 6-pointers or you hunting 12-pointers?
No.
That's the thing. If you're hunting mature bucks, you can't make mistakes. If they walk over your trail and they smell your scent, there's a very, very good chance they're turning around and leaving.
Right.
And guys make mistakes, and they still kill deer. Young deer make mistakes. Mature bucks don't make a lot of mistakes. There's a lot of them out there. How many people you see knocking them down on a regular basis? It ain't too often. And the thing with me is, I try to make everything as perfect as possible. I mean, we all make mistakes, but every time I make a mistake, I'm correcting it. I'm looking at it. I'm dwelling on it. I don't dwell so much on the successes. I dwell on the negatives. And it's not really a negative for me anymore. So I've killed enough deer, I'm comfortable with one getting away.
Right.
But I kind of smile, wave goodbye, and then I put the pieces together.
Right.
What happened here?
Right.
How did he get out of here alive? Because that doesn't happen too often with me.
Right.
What happened here? What went wrong? And I want to make sure that never happens again. If my tree stand makes a squeak, I'm taking that thing apart when I get home and I'm fixing that.
Right.
And I'm making sure that ain't happening again. If it happens once, that happens to everybody. If you go out hunting with a guy and he says, yeah, the buck spooked, my tree stand squeaked, I hate that, it does that all the time. I don't want to hunt with that guy no more.
Because why does it do it all the time?
Because he's a slob hunter. And I don't mean that to degrade anybody, but he's not worried about success. Because if he was worried about it, he'd fix that problem. So I'm constantly, looking at, what did I miss here about the wind that thing winded me where it shouldn't have? What's happening here with this air currents? What's happening here that thing caught my movement? Am I skylit? Is it the color of the shirt?
Right.
Is it something I'm wearing? How did that thing spot me up here? If there's something that goes wrong, I'm fixing it. And with your moving forward, I'm not giving that deer an inch of my scent. I'm not getting it up there and then going backwards. It's not happening.
Right.
If I go to some place and I do have to turn around, I'm going to be able to shoot that spot I walked to. Because if a deer gets there and sniffs it, I'm going to shoot him.
Right. Well, and I think, we all do this because we don't have unlimited time to go and scout every spot that we want to hunt and know intimately where the bedding is in every area. But we can look at a map and we can make some assumptions of where we think it is. Let's say you're hunting an area that maybe it's a private piece or it's a public piece, depending on the pressure. If you have the opportunity to go back there multiple times, stage hunt it, right? Go in a certain amount till you see that sign that particularly catches your eye. And
you think about how we hunted that swamp.
Yep.
We divided that swamp up because we only had one axis.
Right.
So we divided it up into sections, and we decided, okay, where do we hunt first, second, third, fourth? And there was a few days we didn't hunt because
of the wind.
Because of the wind.
Right.
Because we waited for everything to be perfect for those spots. Even though they weren't even our best picked spots. But those spots are getting hunted before we move beyond that point. We're going to cover this whole swamp. And we had to be patient. But I mean, what are we hunting there? Like 15 times and we killed 2 bucks?
Right. And that's a little bit different scenario because it's not as highly pressured. There may be another spot where where you have to get in there and get to a particular area, and you can't wait to hunt it several times per se and stage yourself back in. But that takes a little more knowing what the area is. But in that case, you may pass up sign because you need to get to your specific spot that you've identified as topography that you want to hunt.
Yeah, you got to be able to walk past big rubs, big scrapes, and not even really look at them because they're made in daylight or they're not where they belong.
Right.
If you know how big bucks bed, you can look at an area and go, yeah, this is made at night.
And that's a good point, because if you've identified an area, and a lot of the guys on the forum, if you're trying to identify a bedding area and you walk into a spot and right away you see good sign, a scrape or a rub or a big track, but you're not in close proximity to where you need to be to your bed.
Yeah, don't climb a tree.
Don't climb a tree.
Keep going.
Keep going. Right. Right. Don't get drawn in. Save that for the other guy that's getting out of his truck a little bit late and coming behind you.
You know, a lot of that I want to blame on TV. You know, you watch these TV shows, everybody's setting up on that sign. Everybody's setting up on rubs or open fields and stuff. Come out here and hunt this swamp on an open field sometime. See what you see.
Right.
You know?
And then
and you see guys setting up like that, and I got to think to myself, man, they're watching those TV shows.
right. Well, it's the whole process. I mean, they set up on a field edge. They go out and make the mock scrape. They put up the scent strip, spray the ground with scent, and then they go and up into their stand.
What they got to understand is this ain't 800 acres of highly managed land that one person hunts in Iowa.
Right.
You know, if you're gonna hunt public land and you're gonna hunt pressured deer, or even if you want to take that Iowa managed land and get the best out of it, you got to push that envelope. I mean, look at Andre. I mean, he could sit back and shoot 150s all day long, like all the other pros. He goes after the target animal, and he has to go in there and hunt them down like we hunt them on public.
Right.
Because they don't get to be 6 or 7 years old anywhere by being dumb.
Right.
And you see people like on the forums and stuff, and even on the beast sometimes, knocking a guy. Cause, oh, you hunt, Iowa. Well, yeah, you know what? He's got a little better than you. Yes. But if he shot $5 like that, he knows what the hell he's doing.
Yeah. Yeah.
He's at least doing something right.
Right. Right. And I think, at some level, these principles are going to have to be applied no matter how good a piece of property that you're hunting on. Ultimately, a lot of this stuff has to be applied if you want to kill a mature animal.
Right. You see these pros, got like their hit list or whatever.
Right.
And how often do they get that biggest buck? It ain't too often. Every now and then they get it, but it ain't too often. A hitless buck goes on Andre's property, that thing's dead.
Right. Right. Yeah. Good. Well, anything else on sign? Other things? So, we've said this before. We talked about tracks coming out. We've talked about rubs. We've talked about scrapes. We talked about foliage. Different things that you might see eaten down, whether it be red brush or the greenery in an area. Converging trails.
There's poopies.
Yeah.
You got Scott Shaw, Singing Bridge on the Hunting Beast. I can remember him making a post about saying the largest diameter turds. I got to use a crude word there because there's no good word for it.
Excrement, yeah.
Yeah,
might be
okay. Excrement. Okay. Leave that to manager Mario. But, all right. He said, the diameter. It's all about diameter and the size of the clumps and stuff. And I told him he was on crack. And he said, no, it's a fact. It's a fact. And I looked it up, and it's true. I mean, there's been studies on it. So he was absolutely right on. So I had to go back and apologize to him for calling him out and saying he was on crack. But, so apparently, large clump poop comes from large bucks.
Yeah, so a larger animal is going to...
At least the dominant ones. I think if you go over the hill, because it has something to do with their testosterone level. So the older bucks might not have that.
Right.
But in most cases, the big clumps are going to be the target animals.
Yeah. Anything else regarding sign that you can think of that would help people? I mean, I think in summary, we keep going back to the bedding.
Is that poop near bedding?
Yeah, exactly. Have your spot picked out. Have your area where you think you want to set up. If you get into that area and all of a sudden you get on hot sign, then make the decision there. Either set up on that hot sign or push forward and get back to your area that you planned on hunting anyways and be comfortable with walking past hot sign. Definitely don't backtrack and go back to an area and crisscross your trail and things like that, because like you said, a mature buck is going to pick up on that. during certain times of the year, you've had success on scrapes early in the season. You've had success on scrapes late in the season. Probably my most success hunting over scrapes and sign like that has been when it opens up, in a rut type scenario, and then I know there's bedding in proximity, and I get in there and hunt that area.
It doesn't have to be on bedding. That sign too, and the rubs too, can be in between bedding.
Right.
For rut. I mean, you get your cruising trails, you got your parallel trails, you got your your side of your ridges in that thermal tunnel.
Right.
And I see rubs and scrapes in there. Hey, that's worth checking out. And like guys will always tell me, how high up the hill? How do I know when I'm at the right spot? There seems to be tracks and sign and trails everywhere. If you get up to a spot where you can look back and forth parallel on that trail and see a rub line, you're in the right spot. It doesn't even have to be new rubs.
Right.
It can be years old. That's the cruising elevation that they're cruising at. Now, on some ridges, that'll extend up and down a little bit based on how the wind hits it. So what I do is I go up the waterways, the washouts,
Right.
the ravines, and I go up and I hunt the tips of them. Where all the trails come together and go around.
Right.
So I don't hunt them right in that thermal tunnel all the time because it's easier to narrow down that travel
corridor in that washout.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I guess another thing I should say is that a lot of guys say, which direction is the buck coming out of bedding? A lot of guys got some weird belief that they come out with the wind of the nose or something like that out of beds, which they don't. But, if you're looking for that old sign, it could be an old rub. It's going to tell you a travel pattern, In some bedding areas, they come out multiple ways, but in a lot of them, they come out one way.
Right.
And you can look and you can see the old rubs sometimes. It might not be fresh ones. And sometimes those things will have rubs. And in one year, you go in there and the rubs are gone. There's no rubs in here at all. Well, you might just have a mature buck in there, and that's why you got no rubs. So you can't just walk past that. That's like my idiot old partner used to say, you got to go spot check and make sure there's rubs there. Yeah, you go hunt the 2.5-year-olds. I'll keep hunting the big ones.
Nice. Well, I think with that, we'll probably wrap up this session. Again, if you have any questions or comments on anything that Dan and I discussed, go to thehuntingbeast.com and you can post your comments. And thank you for your time and listening.
That concludes today's podcast episode. Please go to thehuntingbeast.com to post any discussions, questions, or comments regarding today's podcast episode.